and welcome to episode 162 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Denning in Los Angeles.
John, you were just up here fairly recently.
I was, yeah. I had a very, very fun tractor parade weekend up in your neck of the woods, and Calistoga, I think, specifically.
Yes, north of me.
Yep. And the lovely lady who invited me up was just down here the past couple of days, which is why I'm drinking when I'm drinking.
Sounds like a relationship, John.
Oh, how dare you. Do you know that old Mitch Hedberg joke about, I don't have a girlfriend, I just know a girl who'd be real upset if she heard me say that?
Mitch Hedberg is a classic, and if any of you haven't listened to some Mitch Hedberg comedy, I suggest that you do.
Mitch is the best.
And if you do, I suggest that you continue to do so.
I used to do drugs. I still do, but I used to too. Mitch is the best.
That wasn't John actually making a quote. That was Mitch Hedberg.
Yeah, no, that's original. That's a John Denning joke. I am drinking a Bloody Mary.
That's not a John Denning joke. Get out of here.
Fine. I'm drinking a Bloody Mary. Little Tito's, little Zing Zang, which is my favorite mix. And pro tip to all those out there who want to have a good Bloody Mary, little Worcestershire.
You want to say that again?
I feel like I'm going to mispronounce it twice.
Well, then we'll leave you off it.
Worcestershire. Shut up.
That's exactly what I'm doing, is putting you on it.
What do you got?
I have gone in a different direction. I am drinking a Pit Bull, not Mr. Worldwide.
Oh.
All right, so it's not Fireball. This is vodka, in my case, Kettle One. I've switched from Tito's. I don't know why, but I have. Probably because I ran out of Tito's and had a bottle of Kettle One, and I like it. And then some lime juice, grapefruit juice, and then really like 7-Up in the midst of it. So, I mean, look, this is a vodka with juice.
Fair enough. And 7-Up.
And 7-Up.
Interesting.
I think it's some effervescence there.
Oh, yeah.
Tingly.
It'll definitely tingle. I'm feeling tingly too. Speaking of tingles, what'd you pick for a song?
Well, I'm feeling rather aggressive, John. It's been an interesting year, and so been listening to a lot of aggressive music, which I blame my child for.
That's fair.
Who's very much into aggressive music at this point. So I went back actually quite a few years, but the song is called Wake Up, and the band is Rage Against the Machine. And if you've ever seen The Matrix, it's the song that plays at the very end of the movie when he hangs up the phone.
Yeah.
And then he slams out and he goes flying through the air. Right.
Well, there you go.
Ripping opening.
It's pretty classic. I like it.
Indeed.
I won't get into why you're feeling so aggressive. I assume it has to do with Christmas shopping or people.
No need. I'm just feeling energetic and in attack mode. So
fair enough.
John, on that
7-Up effervescence. I love it. Let's talk
LSAT effervescence in your life never hurt.
Can we pivot off your aggression?
Yes, please do.
All right. Let's talk LSAT World. There's not a whole lot going on here. There's a couple webinars that we'll get to, but first, there are 2 tests, obviously, creeping right up on us. They'll be here before you know it. January and February of next year. Nearly here. The registration deadline for the January 2025 test has passed. It was December 3rd. The test dates, and they just opened up scheduling for this, I want to say maybe yesterday or today. But the test dates of that are Wednesday through Saturday, so another 4-day test week, the 15th through the 18th. Scores come out on Wednesday, the 5th of February, and leads right into the February test, which is at the very end of the month. February, I say the very end of the month, the very beginning of the month. Registration is at the end of this month. In fact, it's next week. Registration for February is December 24th. The test dates for February are 2 days, Friday and Saturday, the 7th and the 8th, and you'll get those scores at the end of that month, which is February 26th.
And as usual, John and I will be around for both of those tests.
Yes.
That's the theory, at least. And so when you take a look at January, those 4 days, if you want to let us know how the test went, give us a heads up on any problems that you ran into, by all means, feel free to hit us on either Reddit or X/Twitter, whatever you want to call it. Same thing for February, but I talked about this in the Crystal Ball webinar. That January test is considerably larger than the February test right now. That's why it's 4 days
January's
versus 2.
30-something thousand at this point still, I think.
Yeah, that's what it was the other day. It's starting to come down because obviously the registration deadline's passed, so you can't add people, you can only lose people. But it'll still be relatively large test, and this is looking like a big application group overall anyway. The numbers are running ahead of last year. So either way, there'll be a lot more LSAT to come in January and a little bit less in February. We'll probably see fewer test forms in use, which I know you and I welcome, but at the same time, they sometimes do some squirrely things in February, so I'm not necessarily looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's funny that they've gone back to in-person testing now the last couple of years, in January and February are notorious for weather issues in certain parts of the country. So while I hope that doesn't happen, I do suspect it will. So we'll probably see some extra dates, at least with the makeup tests in January and February. You did mention the crystal ball. You and I did this last Wednesday night, I think. So it's been a week to the day. That recording is still available. You can go on our website and you can request access to it. If you didn't watch it, if you weren't there, if you didn't register for it, you still have access. So it's available for everyone for free, which is pretty cool. We made a lot of predictions about January and February, and we'll likely, I want to put a giant asterisk on that, likely update it for February, specifically with the mini ball after the January test. We'll see.
See how January goes.
I don't want to hold you hostage to that, but I do think it's probable.
Yeah, definitely don't. Probable. We shall see. That would probably be somewhere like January, late January is the most likely period of time to run into that. Maybe like the 22nd to the 25th, somewhere along those lines. But I will say this, it's not just available now. It'll be available all the way up to and through the January LSAT. So
and through February if we don't update it.
Exactly. So if you haven't actually gained access and you decide you want to during, say, like a holiday break or whatever, it'll still be there for you. You can just sign up on the form and then they'll send you access immediately.
Merry Christmas, you filthy animals. Yeah, there it is.
Yep, and free as always.
Free forever. Can I say that?
I would like you to, yes.
Good. There you go. What's on record? Now I'm committed.
There you go.
There's a couple other webinars, free webinars available that are coming up, not until the turn of the year. So you've got a little time to sit on these, but just to make you aware of them, there's one on January 8th, which is on parallel reasoning. That's a very cool one. We break down exactly how to tackle those questions, which can be real time killers. There's one on January 22nd, which is an overview of the test. This is kind of a weird transitional time of year. You know this, of course, where we start to see kind of a new cohort beginning to creep in. It usually happens more in the spring. But we're going to do an LSAT 101 on the nature of how the test is put together on the 22nd of January. And then creeping into February 4th, one of my favorite of all time, one that you and I have actually done before, which is the Reading Comprehension Skills Tests and Diagnostics webinar. Very cool one.
Yeah, that's one of, I think, our pioneering ones.
Yeah, that broke a lot of ground. That's probably the one I hear the most about from people, where they're like, that changed everything. So, yeah, February 4th. There you go.
Excellent. Well, on that note, John, let's talk about the subject du jour, which is principal questions.
Sure.
And, primarily something that you see in logical reasoning, but you see them in reading comprehension as well. Mm-hmm. And this is the type of question that we've been asked about a lot. And we haven't talked about, surprisingly. I mean, we've talked about all sorts of things, whether it's, flaws in the argument or parallel reasoning or outliers like cannot be true. Mm-hmm. All sorts of discussions about conditionality and causality and assumptions. We hadn't gotten to principal questions, which maybe it's apropos that it took this long because the way this question type works is even when we cover it in the books and courses, we wait until very late in the day after we've covered all the kind of like other types for the most part, because I don't think of this as... I think some people do as a specific question type. Right. To me, I never think, principal questions, its own division. Right. You can treat it that way. But for me, principal questions is what I call an overlay.
Yeah. And I think this is probably what makes us, in a way, kind of unique among the people who teach this sort of stuff. We treat these questions a little bit differently. But again, I use the questions pretty broadly. We treat principle as an idea a little bit differently. Compartmentalized, which is cool. So let's start there, Dave. What are principal questions?
You know what? Before we even get to that point, let me just kind of expand upon the question type idea.
Okay.
Because then I think the principle will make a little bit more sense, and what we're saying about question types will probably have a little bit greater context. I think everybody who's taken an LSAT knows that in logical reasoning, we'll just stick to LR for right now. You see all these very specific question types: weaken, must be true, various types of assumptions, what have you. And then what has happened is that when the word principle is thrown into these, a lot of times people have focused on the word principle and said that's a different question type.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, to me, that's not the case. What happens is the principle is never kind of like its own unique question type.
Mm-hmm.
It is always appended to or added on to some other pre-existing type. So you can have a weakened principle, you can have a strengthened principle, you can have a must be true principle,
Right.
parallel principles. All those are really some of the most common ones right there. So when someone comes to me and says, I have trouble with principle questions, I always look inside that information and say, is it all principle questions? Anytime a question talks about principle, because that's going to be one type of problem. Or is it you just keep missing strength and principle questions, which means probably you're having more of a strengthen issue. Now, the presence of the word principle does change things. I think it changes the dimensionality of what you're looking at. So we want to address that.
Yeah, by design, and that's what we'll get into, of course.
Yeah, that's exactly what we'll get into. But to me, it is never something where I look at it and I think this is its own question type and it's divorced from strengthen or weaken or parallel or what have you. Everything that's true about those questions continues to be true. It's just a little bit different because we've added the principle to it. And I think that's what we want to get into
Well,
here.
I like that you described it as like an overlay, because that's exactly how I tend to conceptualize these as well, is you still have the fundamental task of the question type: weaken, strengthen, must be true, parallel. But this just changes the nature of the construction. This just, the flavors it differently, essentially. And so that's, of course, what we're going to focus on here.
And very specifically, I'm sure we'll make this point again, it flavors it by broadening it and making it a bit more abstract.
Yep.
That's usually what happens with this.
We will come to that. So to me, your task basically in these questions is still the same as ever. It depends on the type, whether it's weaken or strengthen or whatever. Weaken wants you to essentially attack an answer choice or an argument with an answer choice. But the nature of the stimulus and the answers themselves changes when they add the principle. So that's what this is about.
Usually becomes less specific and more broad because the principle, as we will talk about in a moment, is this broad idea. And usually a weakened question gets very specific with the facts of the premises or something to do with the conclusion of that relationship.
Right.
This bothers people when they add the word principle in there because it broadens it.
It abstracts it.
It abstracts it.
For anyone who was at the Crystal Ball last week, they heard me talk about this very specifically, where I emphasized how important this question type is, particularly with strengthen as a question type, because they're testing this more and more these days. And as a skill, this seems to be what they're really focused on elsewhere as well, reading comprehension in particular. They're really loving the idea of principle and abstraction.
Yeah. So, if you're studying the LSAT, there's nothing wrong with encountering principles early on. Just realize that if you haven't covered something specific, let's say you haven't really gone deep into parallel questions, and then you run into a principle, it may not be your best performance. You may struggle a little bit. This is why, for me, if I cover the fundamentals of weakened questions first and then later on talk about principles, you already have a foundation for attacking that type of problem. You just have to then understand what the principle does, what its effect is.
Yeah. While I'm putting you on the spot, let's jump to then maybe the most obvious question here, which is, what is a principle? When we talk about principle questions, we've obviously talked about question types, but what does it mean to apply a principle to a question? What is a principle?
That's just a rule.
Good talk. All right. I think we can.
I enjoyed this podcast, John. See you the next time you're up here,
okay, buddy. It's just a rule. To be fair, and for those who think Dave's being a bit glib, he is, but he's also correct. It is. It's just a rule, a guideline, you could call it. Any sort of governance. But to me, they have two kind of key ingredients. The first is that they have to be triggered by something. They have to be initiated. There's some particular scenario or circumstance that will enact the rule. And then, of course, like any good rule, there's an outcome. It leads to something. It might be a behavior, it might be a belief or an idea. It might be an actual physical outcome, but there is going to be some sort of result. So those two things have to happen, as any principle, any good rule would suggest. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Really, these are all conditional statements at their heart.
It's
when we really get down
quite
to it.
Similar to conditional reasoning if you you really want to think about it. And most principles, frankly, are overtly conditional.
Yeah, you can't wear flip-flops in the restaurant, something like that.
Sure.
That is
no shirt, no shoes, no service.
That's your rule, all right? That's your scenario, and of course, the result is they're going to stop you from doing that kind of thing, although it's implicit as opposed to explicitly stated there.
But if you're wearing grown-up person shoes, then you don't have to worry about the rule, and it doesn't apply. And that, to me, is what's kind of interesting about principles, is there's almost always an in and an out case. There's a thing where it will apply, and there's a thing where it won't, or it might not.
And I would say that in LSAT terms, what you're saying is you either meet the terms of the condition or you don't.
Exactly. And so that's the first sort of, we're going to use this word a lot, or at least I plan to, but you match. It matches or it doesn't. Does this rule apply to you? If it does, well, then let's follow it through to its natural outcome. If it doesn't, well, then kill that answer choice.
And this is going to be important in every answer choice because you're often looking to match circumstances, and depending upon the nature of the question, obviously things change, whether it's a must be true or weaken or what have you. But when you have, say, a must be true type of answer and it doesn't match the conditions up above, it's a problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so this idea of matching is going to, I'm going to continue to bring it up because it's my favorite way to think about these, is what are they telling you needs to happen to trigger this? First match that. What are they telling you happens once you've met it? Next match that. So it's just
if anything.
Yeah, if anything. It's a series of matching stages. So
all right, John.
That's really abstract though, I think. Can we do some examples maybe to illustrate what this might look like?
I was just going to suggest that.
Oh, well, go ahead. Do it. Do it, and then you can claim the glory.
All right. So we know there's a really broad scope of these types of things. They are typically more abstract in and of themselves, but they can be narrower and they could be extremely broad. So let's start with one that is relatively narrow.
Okay, let's go narrow first. I like this.
All right.
You want to go? You want to pick one?
I'll take one.
Okay.
How about no street parking on Thursdays from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m.?
That feels like a very neighborhood concern of yours.
No, actually, no one parks around my place. I can't even find where I live.
That's true. You are tucked away.
I'm tucked away. I'm not remote. I'm just hard to find. There's a very, very big difference.
That's pretty fair. I've got so many personality conversations to have with you about that. You're not remote. You're just hard to find. A therapist would have a field day with you, son.
This might be true in life. If I saw one, yeah, probably, but I haven't felt the need yet, so we're good.
I think you're good. If I see you lay on the
someday.
couch,
it's not out of bounds, that's for sure.
Too many pit bulls. No street parking on Thursdays from 6 to 8 p.m. Think of how narrow that is and how specific that is, but also the fact that there is a trigger and an outcome. Every principle will work this way. On Thursdays from a certain time, 6 to 8 p.m., if you park on the street, well, in this case, you're not allowed to. It doesn't specify the consequence, but you're not supposed to be there.
It's implied that you've gotten yourself in trouble.
Something's going to happen. You get a ticket.
You're breaking a rule, and they don't have to be all negative.
Right.
Give me one that's positive.
The one that was occurring to me, and this might be also prohibitive, so this might not suit you, but this was in my head because I was just in a house last week, and I saw this little sign that they had like calligraphied on the wall. I was like, that's pretty annoying to begin with. And it said,
"Don't tell me it was live, laugh, love."
It was worse. Please take your shoes off before going upstairs. I said, first of all, who's just free ranging around your house? And second of all, I will not take my shoes off. How dare you? But that's what I said.
What's your take on that? Just a sidebar here.
What, shoes?
Well, shoes allowed in the house or shoes not allowed in the house?
I have very fancy shoes and you can always replace your carpet. So how dare you? You invited me over. You knew.
Don't speak to me as if I'm this person because I'm a very anti-shoes off person. I'm all about, you come to my house, wear your shoes. I don't care.
You've made me put your shoes on. So please take your shoes off.
I don't like your feet.
Thanks. That's fair. I took my shoes off and you're like, no, wear these. Please take your shoes off
put
before
something
going
on
upstairs.
immediately.
It is a principle. It is a rule. It has a trigger. It has an outcome. If you go upstairs, here's the thing. That you should ignore. But I did see this on a wall the other day, so that's what I was thinking about. But consider that. Consider how in each of these sort of particular circumstances, there's a case where it gets triggered. Is it Thursday from 6 to 8? Don't park on the street. Are you going upstairs? Take your shoes off. That's very narrow principle. And of course, again, neither of these is specified consequences. We'll kick you out, you'll get towed, whatever. But
two things.
yeah,
First off, just to finish the shoes in the house thing.
you're really hung up on
I don't understand it in America unless it's cultural. Like in Japan, for example, it's culturally appropriate to take your shoes off. There, I would do it.
Yeah.
But I have friends here in California, and they're like, "Oh, shoes off," and I'm like, "Oh God, no."
Do you do it, or do you just leave?
No, you have to do it, man. I don't like it though, and inside I'm like, whatever. Did you buy this house to live in, or just to inhabit and try to keep it perfect for whatever potential sale you're going to get in the future?
I'll take my shoes off, but I will also drop food on purpose. So,
well,
that's your
if you have a
trade-off.
dog, that's not really like some kind of violation. The dog thinks you're the greatest thing in the world.
But imagine that you had further sort of conditions to this, which is what the LSAT would typically do. No street parking on a Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. Great. But that doesn't tell you anything happens necessarily. It just kind of implies there's an outcome. But what if it was like violators will be towed, or you'll get a boot or whatever? Then suddenly you can start to see how the implication of this rule would apply. And that's what happens on the test.
You can also you can put as many conditions on it as you want.
Sure.
Now on the LSAT, they're not going to put 10 conditions on it because that would be too much to read. But they can get very specific. They could have 2 or 3 conditions and that wouldn't be considered overly specific at all.
Right.
Your job when you're reading something and you realize you're working with a principal is to understand that, hey, what are the various parts I have to match?
Yeah.
That's a key part of this is knowing what the pieces are at all times, whether there's 1 piece or 3 pieces or however many, and then seeing what happens as a direct consequence, if anything, in those instances.
Yeah. And we're going to talk strategy in just a minute. If anyone's wondering if we're just going to kind of explore shoe policy, we are.
I would like to explore shoe policy. I think it says a lot about somebody's, approach to
Life,
society and a company.
Yeah, I agree with you. But we're also going to talk how to solve these questions in just a minute. But the first thing to do is to understand this. So that's sort of narrow principles. This street at this time on this day, or again, somebody's house rules that are stupid. But you can go broad. There's a lot of almost global principles that you see on the test. You must be 18, at least 18 to vote, or even further, like society should educate children. That's as broad as it gets. That applies to literally everyone.
It is a moral good to help others.
That's, yeah.
If you want to do something morally good, all right, help others and so forth. So it can be super broad. And in fact, some of the hardest questions on the LSAT have this extremely broad-based moral kind of behavioral writing about them that bores me to tears and is really hard to parse. And then they're talking about all these kind of gradations among the morality and so forth. I find those questions personally I'm not going to say they're the hardest because I don't feel like they're the hardest. I feel like they're the dullest.
They're so annoying. I'm just saying, as soon as I start reading one where it's like, a moral action can be, I'm like, oh God, no.
Yeah, I don't want to. Maybe it's just because we object to morality, but I don't want to read those problems.
How dare you? What's the old line about it's nature, nurture, and Nietzsche? Screw you, LSAC. I don't.
Yes. Okay, but if you take a look at something,
those are very principle based. They're as abstract as you get. They're as broad based as you get. They're the world's worst bumper stickers.
Well, you take a principle like a society should educate its children. Mm-hmm. Saying that you should do this. That's as a society. That's a huge group and could encompass all sorts of different parts or not. And then education itself is so broad as to be hard to define. But knowing that broadens the scope of the question.
Absolutely.
The broader the principle, usually the more latitude I have to give the test writers because they've now set the parameters so far out that a ton of stuff is encompassed inside of it. That
you
makes
still
it
have
harder.
to consider what it applies to. Like at least 18 to vote, for instance, applies to whatever citizens are in that country. Society should educate children. I mean, my God, that applies to the world as a whole. Unless it's a childless society somehow, which dare to dream.
Maybe they should educate the children of other societies.
Shit, you're right. So even as I try to find exemptions to this, notice how Dave nitpicks and proves me wrong. It's incredibly important to like really be precise with what these things apply to and what they mean.
I mean, in some respects, I think about this with conditional reasoning is that when you look at a conditional statement, you better know the pieces specifically. Mm-hmm. Same thing here with these principles. They typically get used in a little bit of a different way than straightforward conditional reasoning does on the LSAT, but you still have to know what they are to know what is meeting them or not meeting them.
Yeah.
And just be aware that there's a lot of statements out there. Not everything is a conditional statement. I personally can turn almost anything into a conditional statement, but that's from years of being annoying. There's just a lot of statements where you don't have to be looking for a principle. Like if I say many books are old, the LSAT is not going to use that as a principle. Or some of my friends study 8 hours a day. They're not thinking that that is a principle. Usually it's going to apply to an entire group all at once, which is very much what conditional reasoning is doing.
Yeah.
So everybody who parks on the street on Thursdays from 6 to 8, if you fall into that classification, then the principle applies to you. Some of my friends studying 8 hours a day, harder to do that. And yes, some LSAT people might say, well, there's a way to turn that into something conditional. I realize that. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go for the broader base discussion.
I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to think of ideas in this way. I mean, to me, any conditional, any principle statement has to connect pieces. There has to be two pieces that get linked. That's what conditionality means. But in a sense, I mean, almost every piece of our existence, and I'm not going to go too philosophical here, I promise, although I'm going to threaten it. Almost every piece of our existence is based around this idea. Every decision we make is based around this idea of there's a formula of it's either if I do this thing, I expect this outcome, or if I want this outcome, I'm going to do this thing. It's endless. If I don't want to be late to work, I have to leave at this time. No left turn on red. If I wear these ridiculous shoes, my friends will tease me. If I come up with a specific example here that's explicitly R-rated, you'll get mad. All of these things, all of these things are principle driven. They're all based on the idea of an if-then. And granted, that's conditional, but that's also how principle works. And so the idea of like, what is it going to trigger? What is it going to result in? That's how I tend to think of these things. It's just abstraction. It's a broader rule.
We'll think about this. You know, there's often a discussion about democracy, America, you know, republic, whatever you want to call it, being based upon the rule of law. Mm-hmm. What are laws? You know, they're just really a series of these rules that are principles. Yeah. You can or can't do this. This is not allowed. That's okay. And this kind of thing. So when you wake up in the morning, what happens is you often operate in a rule-based kind of mindset. You're going through, and as you said, all right, you're driving, you know, no right on red or whatever the case may actually be. You've learned that rule. Sometimes it's explicitly stated, sometimes it's not, but it is everywhere around you. This is not something where people who encounter principles and have difficulty are thinking, oh, I can't deal with principles. They may think that in the LSAT context, but I can guarantee that in their real lives, they're generally quite comfortable with principles because they're applying them constantly, and society is applying them constantly back to them. So the difficulty here isn't in you as a student and it's some kind of innate inability to understand these questions, because a lot of people think they're very hard.
Yeah.
It's the way the LSAT is presenting them to you and the rules they use around them that is causing the difficulty.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I mean, again, not to get too deep on this, but the whole nature of the legal practice is built around the idea of precedent. Precedent is principle. This case happened. Here's a thing we drew out of it. Does it apply again? That's all this is. So if you don't think principle are your strong suit, welcome to the rest of your life.
You'll get better over time, and then in law school, you'll get much better at it.
Yes.
But instead of just talking around the idea of like, oh, this is the way they do it, and this is the way the LSAT presents it that causes difficulty, let's talk a little bit about what they do with this in LSAT questions. Because I think there's really two big formulaic structures that they use, at least to present it from a question standpoint. If we understand those, then maybe we can go through some specific examples and kind of talk through that.
Yeah. So broadly, the idea of a principal question as an overlay, regardless of question type, is you get a pairing. a corresponding pairing. We have very specific details of a scenario or a circumstance. And then you have a broad rule, like we've talked about, like a guideline, something more generic. The difference is you get those in two different places. The first form is when you get the principle in the stimulus. The stimulus has the principle, the broad rule, the guideline. It's very generic. Can I just, off the top of my head, riff one?
Sure.
Okay. Prepare to groan with me, you and listeners. Something like the idea of like an action can be deemed immoral if the outcome can be reasonably thought to cause harm and an alternative and less harmful course of action was available. That's a principle. That's as generic and boring as you can get. Yuck. But then what you get following that is 5 answer choices, each of which would have a very specific circumstance or situation, scenario, to which that principle might apply. Usually this looks like must be true. It can be a lot of different things. It's very adaptable, but this is typically what you see. So you get this broad generic thing in the stimulus, and each answer choice has a vary. So an answer might be a traditional sort of detail-based situation where you just test whether it matches the specifics. 1 will match. 4, assuming it's not an accept question, 4 won't match. So an answer choice might be something like, I don't know, Dinesh behaved immorally when he gave Sarah a peanut butter sandwich because he knew that she had a nut allergy and he had other food available. That would fit the specifics of the principle. It's immoral to do a thing when you suspect there's harm and you have alternatives.
So literally what you just did there was you took the principle from what would have been the stimulus and said, all right, let's look at answers that are going to typically illustrate kind of like a more parallel type of word there, what that is. And they're going to find one that actually matches it or, the contrapositive as the case may be. And then there'll be other answers that don't match it. They misstate parts of it or they don't meet certain conditions that are required.
To take that same answer and make it wrong, I could say something like Vinesh behaved immorally despite not knowing that Sarah had a peanut allergy. Why is that wrong? Because he didn't know. And that was part of the principle. It needed to match that piece. So you
reasonably thought to cause harm.
Exactly. You can start to see the parallelism in terms of just, again, one-to-one matching. That's all we're doing in these questions. That's all it ever is just magic.
It's a match game. Yeah, when my daughter was young, whenever she saw things that matched, she would say, go match. And that's exactly what you're doing here. It's essentially Sesame Street, but at a really high intellectual level. Now, the scenario that you're talking about is where the principle is in the stimulus. It doesn't have to be that way.
Right. There's an
the
alternative.
Other model that the alternative model that we see is where you get, kind of like a normal stimulus, as it were, and then you get 5 answer choices, which each of one will contain a principle of sorts. Usually this is going to be a strengthen or weaken type of question, some always. Variant on that.
Or justify.
And here, you're trying to find the principle that will actually either make the argument make sense, hey, they must have followed this principle, or perhaps if the answer is true, it weakens the argument because they violated what would be that principle there. So again, if you match the details and understand what the goal is, whether you're trying to help or hurt, there's only going to be one answer that actually kind of like conforms to what you're looking for, which is always the case here.
Yeah. I can tell you, Dave, and leading up to this conversation, I was just curious. I went through, it had to be hundreds of these questions, and virtually all that were built on that model that you just described, a traditional stimulus, specific scenario, followed by 5 very abstract or generalized answer choices. Virtually all of them were strengthened.
Yeah.
There's way more strength. +% were strengthened.
And it's easier to think why that would be the case, because this is where you go back and you're like, what is easiest for the test writer? It's way easier to do a strengthened principle type of scenario than a weakened principle type of scenario. It's just more work to make that out. So they're going to go towards the easiest path more often than not. So I'm unsurprised to find that be the case.
Yeah, I can tell you it was almost stultifying. It was just one after another after another. I was like, good God, they're all strengthened. And I mentioned this in the Crystal Ball last week. I was like, look, if you're going to study something, guys, and want to develop this skill, strengthened principle, that's the place to really lean in. That's what you're going to see in all likelihood.
The must kind of principle result is pretty straightforward because it's got the must be true fact-based kind of idea. The parallel version of that is like 5 scenarios that are supposed to fit it. Now you're playing the match game.
Yeah.
And then strength and principle is the one where strength and questions are typically not people's strongest question type.
Yep.
So that would be the place to focus.
It completely inverts it. In fact, I find this so compelling. If you don't mind, if you'll indulge me, let's talk strategy. Because I know a lot of people are listening to this and like, but how do I actually solve them? How do I attack these? Let's look at both of those constructions, principle and stimulus, principle and the answer choices, and think about how to approach both. And I think we can probably narrow it down to the 2 scenarios that are most likely. Principle and stimulus is almost certainly must be true. Principle and the answer choices is almost certainly strengthen. Can we play with both?
Sure.
Cool.
Why would I say no to that?
I don't know. You say no to a lot of things that I suggest, and you're usually correct.
Not this. This is pretty benign.
Okay. Yeah, usually what I
We've already
suggest
crossed
is like
the line
Tijuana.
once tonight.
And you're like, oh.
So let's not cross the line again.
Okay. Let's talk about principle and the stimulus. To me, this is interesting in that it's, I guess I could call it the more adaptable arrangement. Lots and lots and lots of different question types will fit into this particular template or mold. Most frequently, though, it does go with must be true, and slightly less frequently parallel. You can see these with question stems like the principle above, if valid, most strongly supports which one of the following arguments, or which one of the following judgments, that's another word they like to use, which one of the following judgments conforms most closely to the principle stated above. But this is where you're going top down. So let's play with must be true first as a solution. And you and I both used, and I'm glad you jumped on board, both used the word match a lot. It's my favorite way to think of these things. It's literally just a one-to-one, piece-by-piece matching exercise. But let's talk about what happens if you start with a principle and then get specific. Let me give an example. And this is based off a question. I told you I read 1,000 of these the other day. It's similar to, inspired by. Here's an example. So I'll give a principle first, and then we'll get into specifics. Here's the principle. For a work of art to be considered great, it must be original and widely influential. So 2 requirements for a work of art be considered great. And then you can actually break the pieces of this down. You can go component parts, which is what you should do. Whether that's explicit on like scratch paper, you just keep them in mind. But what are the pieces of that? There's something to be considered great art, and 2 requirements. Has to be original, has to be influential.
Widely
influential. Fair. Okay.
I would think that would actually be one of the places they could play with.
Like it just influenced one person.
Influence in a subset, not widely.
Right. It was huge in Soho in the 70s or something, but that's not quite enough. Fair. So to me, as soon as I see that widely influential and original, those are the pieces that I'm looking for. And I would just immediately begin to scan the answer choices to match, to see what does or doesn't have those pieces. Any answer choice that talks about what is not considered great art draws a conclusion, you're stuck. If something's not great art, you don't know anything, because great art requires things. It needs these things, but it doesn't tell you anything necessarily, if that makes sense. If it is great
makes
art,
sense to me.
Sure. If it is great art, then you know some certain things. You know it's influential. You know it's widely influential. But if something's not great art, you're stuck. Again, this is just basic conditional reasoning, right? So what I would be looking for here is an answer choice that's missing one of those required pieces. It's either not original, it's not widely influential, and you, again, pedantically suggested that it might be narrowly influential. And that would be enough to tell you certain things. That's what I would be looking for in an answer choice, or both. Perhaps they're both missing. Then you knew it wouldn't be great. And the answer in this actual question that I'm drawing this from is there was a particular painting, and it's very original, but almost entirely unknown. It means it's not widely influential, which means it can't be considered great. And that's how the principle gets up. Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the contrapositive. That's how the principle gets applied to a specific piece. I think this was about Picasso.
So let me run this scenario from a slightly more abstract standpoint.
I didn't know we could do more abstract. Go for it.
it's going to get that way.
Well, I mean,
mainly in terms of how I'm viewing this through the lens of conditionality. So you came in here and it's like, if it's great art, and I'll say considered great art, that's to me could be something they would play with, although maybe not. It's original and widely influential. All right, so the sufficient condition there is the great art. If you conclude something is not the sufficient condition, you don't know anything. So if you say something's not great art, therefore whatever, that is wrong immediately, because once you negate the sufficient condition, you can't draw a conclusion. If you try to, that is obviously a negation that doesn't work.
Yeah, this painting's lousy, you're stuck.
Okay, so I would know that is a wrong answer. Also, if you have another answer where they say that, hey, something is known to be original and widely influential, and then they try to say that it's great art, or widely, considered to be great art, that also is wrong. That's a mistaken reversal. Just because you matched the necessary conditions does not mean that you can then say the sufficient condition happened. Those two answers are going to appear on multiple occasions in a problem like this, and they're all going to be wrong. You are really looking for one of two correct answer forms. The first is where something is considered to be great art, therefore it says that it has to be either original, and widely influential. So really just a repeat form of what you were given, or the problem that you cited here, which was a contrapositive, where you didn't have one of the necessary conditions, so you knew the sufficient condition could not occur. Principal questions that are built on this structure are incredibly predictable. And that is something where I think people, they get drawn into the idea of each principle being different and having to consider each problem on its merits. And when I think about these problems, I don't think about it that way. I'm like, find me the principle. Now I'm going to take a step back and say, what's the form of the wrong answers, which are highly predictable, and what is the form of the likely right answers? The repeat form that I mentioned first as a right answer will happen. It just happens less than the contrapositive form that you showed up, because the contrapositive requires further manipulation and thought. So of course they want you to take that extra step. So when we abstract this out and we think from the standpoint of doing the problem, yes, the principle is important because I need the actual pieces, but the abstract approach to it allows you to just fly through these types of problems and solve some of them at a really rapid rate of speed. And some of the wrong answers, if you really start thinking about the principle, you can get very confused. If you see the form of it, you can just fly right past it and say, no, I know that's wrong. There's the LRB in particular, and our courses go through these types of problems and actually talk about this exact structural setup and explain this. So I'm obviously a big fan of understanding it at this level.
Well, and I mean, again, the utility goes even beyond the individual question, which is to say that it applies as a skill to so much else on the test, including a lot of reading comprehension. I made this point last week in the crystal ball, where I was like, look, if you get good at these questions, you get good at the test. And frankly, you get good at being a lawyer, because so much of what you're going to do for the rest of your life, presumably, is built around this exact skill. This is important.
It is. Well, also, you're showing this high-level ability to manipulate statements. If you can understand like principles and conditional statements at a really abstract level like this in your mind, you now have the ability to kind of see further than others, because you're not drawn into the details. You've risen above the forest. You see all those trees, but you're also seeing the entire scope of the forest and how it's constructed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right and well said. Of course, there is an inverted construction of this where you don't get the principle to start. You get a very, again, consistent or familiar type of stimulus that's followed by principles in the answer choices. These, though, tend to be a little bit narrower in terms of question type. These are almost always strengthened. Slightly less common is sufficient assumption, what we call justify, and then much less common, weaken. Let me give you some question stems that people could recognize these with. Which of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the reasoning above? Classic strengthen. If you're going to most help to justify, you're just going to help. Which one of the following principles, if established, would confirm the belief above? Justify. So these are the other version of this. They happen, again, because I did a pretty deep dive into this the other day, they happen about as often. It's about 50-50 between the two types, principle and the stimulus. Principle is each of the 5 answer choices. But as we've talked about, with this form, as you have the principles and the answer choices. What you're really testing now is the effect, the outcome that each one has on the specific argument that you've just read in the stimulus, which means you're really paying attention to the conclusion. And the concept of matching, it still perfectly applies, but in the opposite direction. So the elements in the answer choice, that's what you're checking. That's what you're making sure are present in the argument. And the desired goal, typically to help, sometimes to hurt, sometimes to prove, like justify. But that's what you're really measuring here. To help, though, which is what we'll focus on, you want the principle to apply to the scenario and then lead to the conclusion in some sort of more likely or more believable circumstance. Make sense?
Does make sense.
I don't know, I'm asking you. Dave, did I teach you a thing?
Always, John.
Always.
You know, the thing I would say is this, is that the matching point that you're making here is very interesting, because what you want in these strengthened questions, and I agree with you, we should really focus on those, is that when it matches, if you have an answer choice, they're talking about something and it matches the details of the stimulus and it's kind of reaffirming what they're saying, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Because it's saying on a broad level, this is the case. In those weakened questions, what you want to do is really match the details of the stimulus, but say it's bad. Say that it's different than what the conclusion actually is.
The application
kind of
has to match.
wrong.
The outcome has to be different. That's what you're looking for.
That's exactly right. Yeah, to me, I think in my mind, matches the sufficient, and then the necessary is different. But I like the application outcome description equally well.
We're saying the same thing, but thanks. Yeah. So there you go. So that's the way that I tend to think of these questions. It's still, again, the same principle, and I cannot stress this enough. It's the same principle of matching. What are the details of the principle, the rule, the guideline, and then do those pieces simply have a correspondent piece in the specific details of what you read. Going down, going up, doesn't matter. They have to match. So that's my take.
Why didn't we just call this whole episode Go Match?
Go Match. Oh, because then we'd have to give your daughter credit, and I'm very against that. You know me.
They don't want it. I can guarantee that.
I'm very selfish about credit. I want the glory, Dave. I want the glory.
You can have it.
Cam gets nothing from me.
That's right.
Should we do an example?
Yes.
We can play with one. All right. This, again, is taken from a question that I read. Now, I've adjusted these enough so that I don't think I'm violating any copyrights, but they're inspired by, let's do a strengthened principle where the answer choices each have principles, and we'll go up. So we'll start with something more specific in the stimulus. And this actually was a teacher. So this was kind of prefaced with the speaker. And it was talking about, in my example, Shakespeare. So there's a teacher who says, teaching students Shakespeare before they're advanced readers can significantly benefit them. However, if students are not ready for the nuance and unfamiliar phrasings that Shakespeare uses, they may get discouraged and lose their love of reading altogether. So here's the conclusion. If we're going to teach mid-level readers Shakespeare, we must be sure they can handle the nature of the language involved. You could take this immediately and turn it into a principle, and I encourage people to do this just as a practice. How would you describe what you just heard or read in the case of the test? How would you turn this into a principle? For me, it would be something along the lines of, we need to use some discretion about who we expose to higher level ideas, because for the wrong group, it's demoralizing, demotivating. You're going to kill their enthusiasm.
Okay.
So there you go. If we want to strengthen that, Dave, what do we want to do? Well, first, we want to support the idea that teaching Shakespeare can be beneficial, provided, and this is the key, that some care is taken, some discretion is used about the group who's being taught. We need to be selective.
Well, not just selective. They've made it quite clear they have to be able to handle the nature of the language.
That's what we select.
And is specific to the mid-level readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, you're being very precise with this, as any good test taker should be. As you should. Don't treat me this way in real life, but when it comes to test questions.
I think I do, though.
You
Is
really
that not
do
the
hold me
case?
to a high standard, and it's infuriating. It's infuriating because I talk a bunch of nonsense.
This sounds like a normal conversation, except we wouldn't be talking about Shakespeare.
No, and there'd be worse language. But What's a good answer choice going to do? And again, remember, the answer choices here are going to be the principles. The answer choice is going to go very broad, generic, abstract. The right answer for this question was along these lines. It was only those who, without losing enthusiasm, can meet the cognitive challenges that new intellectual work involves should be introduced to it. Now notice what that answer choice doesn't include. English, reading, Shakespeare. None of that. It's very generic. It's very broad. And that is the difficulty in these questions is, can you see the correspondence? Can you see the application? But if only those who can keep their enthusiasm while they are exposed to these new cognitive challenges, as it says, only those are the ones who should be exposed to it. Well, yeah, you've just supported the argument that we need to be selective about who we teach Shakespeare to.
Yeah, and from a matching standpoint, if you think about it, you may not have heard the exact words, but did you hear those ideas?
Ideas.
For example, can meet the cognitive challenges. Well, didn't they say in this problem, we must be sure they can handle the nature of the language involved?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me the difference between those two. There really isn't one.
Yeah.
They use that phrase as a rewording of it. It's synonymous in terms of its meaning, although it doesn't have the exact same words. But can meet the cognitive challenge has got a huge umbrella effect to it.
Yeah.
And that would include the idea of handling the nature of the language involved and so on. And so this is where the match part, some people, this is where they lose these problems because they're like, they didn't use the same words. I'm like, it's not about the same words. You're not trying to match A to A. You're trying to match the idea of A to another idea or rephrasing of A. You have to rephrase in these problems and understand what you're actually reading.
Yeah. That umbrella idea is so critical. The idea of like, does this encapsulate that, the synonymities of what you're reading? If you can do that, if you get good at that, that skill will take you so far on this test. I don't know what the top 3 would be, but it's on the podium. It's on my Rushmore. I know that's 4.
All right.
Yeah.
Strong endorsement.
But notice, again, this is where the nature of the question type does actually apply. If this was weakened, we'd be looking for a different outcome. We'd be looking for a different effect. This is strengthened. So we're trying to support, we're trying to agree with. In the same way, if this was must be true, a wrong answer, in fact, a wrong answer in this question, can agree with what you just read, but not necessarily support the conclusion of it. The conclusion of that is we need to be careful who we try to teach this idea to, who we try to expose to Shakespeare. But remember, a part of that, a premise of that, was if you expose the wrong people, they'll get demotivated. They'll lose their fervor for reading in general. So you could have a wrong answer that says something in agreement with that, like people faced with a new intellectual challenge can become discouraged with the discipline as a whole. That's true. It says they can do it. It says they can lose their interest. But that doesn't support the conclusion that you need to be picky about who you teach.
Yeah, true. And it sounds relevant because it's about some of the same ideas, but it doesn't change anything about the way we look at the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is why it's so important. And this is why, again, to circle back to your point, just kind of bookend it. You mentioned that we don't teach this early in our courses, despite the fact that this is a key skill. It's because you need to understand question types before you can do this well.
Let me also kind of like supplement that by saying we teach all the skills before that you need to lead up to this. It's not that, oh, hey, we're just going to make you wait on it. We're teaching other things to lead into this, one of which is looking at various question types, but also there's a whole ton of like fact-finding skills through must be true and strengthen and weaken that you want to be able to do in the specific, which most people find easier. If you give the average student a really specific question with very good details, they like that better than a really broad, loose, abstract question.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you get really good at the detailed ones, it's easier to move up to those more broader, more abstract ones. So it's quite by design and not by some accident. Oh, gee, we just did principle at the end. No. It'd be like if I was teaching, on the first day of LSAT classes, assumption questions. I'm like, we're way ahead of ourselves here. Maybe we should start with what must be true and figure out if we can read for facts before we start thinking about let's go into the head of the author. There's an order that you can do this that actually makes logical sense. I have tried to adhere to that throughout the many years that I've been doing this.
Yeah, it's not as arbitrary as it seems sometimes.
No, it's never
There's
arbitrary.
No promise. There's a method to our madness. I tried to explain this to my niece at Thanksgiving. She goes, "Why do we have to wait till December 25th?" And I said, "I have no idea. I'll be honest. There's no good reason." There's no good reason.
I'm sure your sister loved that answer.
It's like, there's no good reason at all. Santa's not real. So, yeah, there you go. It's not even a solstice. It's nothing. It's nothing.
I hope you did not say that to her, John.
No, I didn't say that to her.
See, you have a heart. It's somewhere in there. It's small, but it is there.
It's going to go 3 sizes too big. And on that note, that's principal questions in a nutshell. And a slight peek behind the curtain of my psychology, which I apologize for. They're quirky. They're
As
tricky.
You should.
But what I will say, and I'll repeat, it's not just the test of abstraction, which these obviously are consistently measuring, and an understanding of different question types, which obviously is important here too, because there's a lot of value to these. But with practice, you will find, I promise you will find, that not only will you routinely answer these questions correctly, but you'll find a significant percentage of the rest of the test begins to feel easier as well.
Yeah, and let me add this. Start looking at these questions first through the lens of the question type that you're looking at. Is it weaken? Is it strengthen? Is it must be true, parallel, what have you? Start looking at it through that lens, because all the truth about those various question types will apply to these as well. Yeah. And then secondly, open it up a little bit. Make sure you understand the principle, get the details of that, but realize that things are going to sound a little bit broader and more abstract. That second example about the teaching Shakespeare is a great way of seeing, oh, this answer applies, but you might not have realized it at first. So that's what I always think. Principles in addition, and the addition kind of like makes things broader and a little bit looser and a little bit less defined, maybe is the best way to say that. Yeah. But they're still quite doable because you already have the fundamental principles at hand to do all the various question types. This just adds another dimension to them.
That's perfectly said. I can say just anecdotally and personally, when this clicked for me, when the nature of how principle questions and just the idea of principles themselves clicked for me, this entire test began to make more sense. Everything got easier.
Yeah, second level stuff.
Yep. That's when I really felt like I was in control of what was happening here. It wasn't happening to me. I was doing it. And that's what these questions can unlock for you.
Yeah, you see around the corner because now you know what's coming. This is the type of problem when we do it. We start talking about right and wrong answers. And in certain cases, I'm like, I know what you're going to do now. Let me find it, as opposed to just absorbing body blow after body blow as you go through each answer choice, trying to figure out what the hell they just said.
It's a powerful feeling. It's great.
And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions, or if you just like to talk about my views on the social use of shoes in the home, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, hope that you have a fabulous holiday season. We look forward to talking to you again soon. Stay safe out there.